Good day. Today is 14th December 2024, and we are coming closer to the end of 2024, which has proved to be a most extraordinary year. And I'm going to touch firstly on the situation in Syria again. I suspect most of my program will be, however, about Ukraine and about what is happening, taking place there. But then I will try, if I have the time, to touch on to other things like the latest impeachment vote in South Korea and the new election of the president of Georgia. So an awful lot going on, but let me try, first of all, and start with the situation in Syria. And yesterday, in the media, and indeed continuing this morning, I noticed that certainly in Britain, there appears to be a concerted attempt to spin the events in Syria with reference to the Russian bases. A whole series of articles have been appearing in the British newspapers and on British television talking about the Russians fleeing from across Syria, about how the Russians might be preparing to quit the bases. There's been some attempts at mockery of the Russians and things of that kind. I should say straight away that this is a good example, again, of one of those operations where all of the media, certainly in Britain and to some extent in the United States, seems to speak in unison, covering the identical story, often reporting the same set of facts and giving the same spin to them. All of this happening right across the media, which to a detached observer might beg some questions. But anyway, what is actually going on? I say that because yesterday, of course, all of the reports were different. They spoke about discussions being underway between HTS and the Russians about the Russian bases staying in Syria. Well, I'm going to say straight away that I suspect that this campaign that we're seeing in the British media today, and there are echoes of it in other parts of the Western media, also in the United States, less so maybe, but in Europe definitely, that all of this is partly being provoked by precisely those reports which appeared yesterday that HTS and the Russians were closing in on some sort of agreement whereby the Russian bases in Syria might actually remain. And clearly someone in London, and I assume it was in London, wasn't happy with that. And the result was that we got this whole cluster of stories that appeared in the media in Britain, and as I said, which have found their echoes in all sorts of places afterwards, talking about a humiliating escape by the Russians from across Syria. So what is really going on? Well, the first thing to say is that there is absolutely nothing happening in Syria which is consistent with anybody fleeing. If we're talking about the Russians, what is clearly been taking place, and we've discussed it on the Duran, and I've discussed it in programs on this channel, what is clearly happening is that Russian forces from across Syria, who were positioned in support of the former Syrian government, the government of Bashar al-Assad, which has now fallen. Anyway, those Russian troops have clearly received orders to withdraw and to consolidate in the two bases in Latakia region, in Tartus and Khmeimim, principally Khmeimim. And we've been seeing movements of Russian troops moving across Syria, consolidating in these bases. And the most important fact is not that these troops are consolidating in Latakia, in the two Russian bases. That is completely predictable and is exactly what one would expect, given that the government that those troops had been allied to and which were which they were, in a sense, supporting, or whose armed forces they were supporting, has collapsed. What is remarkable about these Russian movements is how completely unimpeded they are. This is a country which has been overrun by all sorts of jihadi militias, where the dominant force is HTS. HTS has concentrated, has been opposed to the Assad government for over a decade. It has been repeatedly targeted by the Russian Air Force. I have now received what I consider to be a very reliable report, which says that the number of HTS fighters killed by the Russian bombing over the 2-week period preceding the collapse of President Assad's government, that the number of jihadi fighters who were killed in that bombing exceeds 2,000. So, very heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force, inflicting serious losses on HTS. That is a significant proportion of the total force that HTS committed to the conflict. And yet, nonetheless, after Assad steps down, despite the fact that Assad was smuggled out of the country by the Russians and is now safely in Moscow, where he has been granted political asylum together with his family. Despite all of that, despite the fact that one would assume that HTS fighters are profoundly hostile to the Russians after that kind of experience, on the contrary, all of the evidence shows that there is a careful avoidance of clashes. The Russians are able to move their forces from across Syria. Not a single convoy has been obstructed or has come under fire. There have been no incidents of any kind whatsoever. And that is important, and it is interesting, and it shows that clearly there's been some kind of understanding between the Russians and HTS reached. And it also confirms a point which I made on a video that has been published today by myself and Alex Christoforou on the Duran, which is that it's increasingly clear to me that HTS as a military force is not in a position to fight the Russian army or the Israeli army or the American army or the Turkish army. It simply doesn't have those capabilities, and it is keeping well away from any kind of armed confrontation with any of these armies that are now located on Syrian territory. And in fact, it goes further than this, because there are reports circulating, reports which I consider to be completely reliable, that HTS fighters, far from doing anything to try to impede the Russians, are on the contrary located in the perimeters around the bases and the diplomatic quarters that the Russians have in Damascus, and are providing a certain degree of protection to those bases. They're making sure that other jihadi fighters who might perhaps have been interested in launching attacks on the Russians are not able to do so. Though I have to say that so far there is no evidence that anybody is trying to attack the Russians at all, not other jihadi fighters, not HTS. Now, HTS, from what I can see, is heavily influenced, probably controlled by the Turkish government. The head of Turkish military intelligence has recently visited Damascus. He's been seen with Mr. Jalani, the nominal head of HTS. He's clearly been touring the capital. He's been having meetings with all sorts of people there. But it's quite obvious from the way this head of Turkish military intelligence has been acting that he is the person who is actually in charge to the extent that anybody in Syria at the moment, or at least in Damascus, is in charge. I don't think it is taking things too far to say that this person, head of military intelligence, Mr. Kalin, is giving instructions to Jelani, who passes down the instructions to the HTS fighters, and of course there's other Turkish military officials and intelligence officers spread out across Syria, and they're playing a significant role in coordinating this whole operation. So, most likely, despite the discussions that are nominally taking place between the Russians and HTS about the bases, the real discussions are taking place between the Russians and the Turks. I ought to say that there are a number of other airfields across Syria which the Russians have used over the course of their involvement in Syria. I've seen pictures of an airfield in, I think it is northern Syria, where there had been a Russian presence, and Russian aircraft enter and exit this airfield as they do Khmeimim Air Base, and they come and go completely unimpeded. Now, to finish with what the Russians themselves are doing, it's absolutely clear that as more and more Russian personnel arrive at the bases, Russian aircraft arrive, collect them, and are bringing them back to Russia. What is not clear at the moment is whether this is a plan by the Russians for a general evacuation, whether the Russians have made a decision to give up the bases, to leave the bases entirely, or whether, on the contrary, this is simply removing surplus personnel who had been present across Syria, bringing those people back to Russia, even as the Russians decide to maintain a presence at the bases in Syria. And I should say that on that point, I'm getting other reports that other troops from Russia, Wagner fighters and Marines and some paratroopers, have been sent to Khmeimim. But of course, we can't be sure whether they're there as a covering force to ensure the protection of the bases until the Russians pull out, or whether instead they're going there to consolidate control. There is a negotiation about the bases that is underway. The Russians have spoken about this. HTS is not contradicting them. HTS has gone out of its way to say that it wants good relations with the Russians, and Erdogan has gone out of his way to say that he values his strong relationship with the Russians also. And from Erdogan's point of view, as well as from HTS's point of view, there is reason why Erdogan would want the Russian bases to stay. First of all, the bases are no conceivable threat to Turkey. I think that is an obvious and simple point to make. Nor, realistically, following the fall of Assad, are the bases going to be a immediate threat to the hold, the control that Turkey has established across Syria. Most of the challenges to Turkish control will come from the fact that the country is disintegrating and the difficulty of slowing or reversing the chaos. It will not come from the Russians. The Russians have shown no interest in trying to regain some kind of political authority in Damascus. Just saying. But so they're not a threat or a challenge or a problem to Erdogan and to the Turkish authorities, but they do have some value to Erdogan and the Turkish authorities if they remain. And that value is really very simple. Firstly, they give Turkey leverage over Russia. The Russian bases remain, then given that the rest of Syria for the moment is a Turkish protectorate, that the militias spread out across Syria for the moment, and HTS specifically, are largely controlled by Turkey. The Russians will know that if they fall out with Erdogan, there is a risk from these militias and from HTS to the bases. Erdogan and his officials, of course, at the same time as they deny all involvement, will no doubt make it possible, ensure that all sorts of trouble is experienced by the Russians in those bases so long as they are there. So the existence of the Russian bases in Syria gives Erdogan leverage over Moscow and over Putin. And of course, the presence of the bases also simultaneously gives Erdogan and Turkey leverage over the Americans, because the Americans will not be happy that the bases are still in Syria, the Russian bases are still in Syria. They will be anxious to see those bases go, and they know that the only person who can get those bases out of Syria is Erdogan, and one can imagine easily how Erdogan could use that to extract concessions from the Americans. Anybody who has followed Erdogan's career closely, especially since he became the unchallenged leader of Turkey, will know that he likes nothing better than obtaining leverage, and once he has it, he uses it very effectively in his interests, and as he sees it, in Turkish interests as well. And any party who assumes that any agreement they reach with him on these sort of matters is going to be long-term and binding is likely to be disappointed. Just saying. So it makes sense why Erdogan would want the bases to remain, and that provides some explanation for the discussions that are undoubtedly taking place at the moment, nominally between HTS and the Russians, but in practical terms between the Russians and the Turks. Now, the big issue, therefore, is, do the Russians want to keep their bases? And I have discussed this until a few days ago, until yesterday. I assumed that they didn't. There might be different arguments, however, about this in Moscow. And it has been pointed out to me in a very interesting private email, that not only have the bases played a useful, though not, in my opinion, essential role in keeping Russian troops and missions across Africa supplied. There's been a lot said about that. But Syria has been the main center for Russian intelligence gathering in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. That, by the way, has been consistently true since the 1960s. So the presence of the intelligence gathering facilities in Syria long predates the presence of the Russian naval and air bases in Tartus and Khmeimim. And the Russians will be very sorry to lose these intelligence gathering facilities, the listening stations, the radar stations, all those sort of things. Because realistically, there is nowhere else in the Middle East where they can place them. And it could even be, when these issues are discussed in Russia's Security Council, that it is the loss of these intelligence assets, the listening and radar stations and those sort of things, that weigh on the Russians more than the naval and airbase facilities. Having said that, I'm going to venture my own guess here, which is that more likely than not, I think the Russians have made a quiet decision, or at least the Kremlin has made a decision that they should leave. And one of the reasons they will want to leave is because I think that they doubt the long-term viability of these bases without a stable government in Damascus that is friendly to them. That is obvious. But secondly, I think they will feel very, very uncomfortable about, to put it mildly, about giving Erdogan even more leverage than he has over them already. The fact that from Erdogan's point of view, it is useful for the Russians to stay is, I suspect, something that in Moscow will incline some people to say that that's a very good reason why the Russians should go. Now, there have been a number of decisions over the last 24 hours which it seems to me are consistent with the Russians having made a decision to leave the bases. The first is that it's clear that the air defense system that was created around the bases, the S-400 system, its associated radars, and the point defense systems that had been built up around it, it looks as if that is being dismantled. There are satellite pictures which appear to show elements of the S-400 radar system being loaded onto Russian transport aircraft and returned to Russia. Obviously, the Russians do not want this very valuable and powerful system to fall into the hands of unfriendly powers, and for that reason, it's understandable if they are deciding to evacuate the bases, that they are acting to dismantle it and to bring it back home. Now, the dismantling of the air defense system around the bases, it seems to me, is a very strong sign that a decision has been made to evacuate the bases and to give up the bases. Because without air defenses, the bases are intensely vulnerable to attack, and I think that the Russians recall that the bases have been attacked over the course of their existence on several occasions, and I don't think they will want to keep troops and aircraft in bases that are vulnerable to attack. So I think this is the strongest indicator that the Russians actually do intend to leave the bases. The second is that the Russians yesterday announced that they are ending their supply of grain to Syria. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the sanctions pressure on Syria, the crisis that this has caused in the Syrian economy, the collapse of the Syrian economy, and the intense hardship that the Syrian people have suffered. And this is undoubtedly correct, But it's important to say that Syria has never been left completely on its own. The Russians have been consistently sending large supplies of wheat and foodstuffs to Syria, and from what I can tell, they've been doing it on a purely humanitarian basis, because Syria has been in no position really to provide much in the way of funding. And to my knowledge, the Russians have also provided oil and some consumer goods. And in fact, the Russians have ensured that Syria, for all the hardships that people have suffered there, it's the Russians who have kept the economy there ticking along to the extent that it has been able to. And it is the Russians who have basically prevented the situation in Syria descending into an outright humanitarian catastrophe of the sort that we're seeing play out in Gaza. This has not been something that has been widely reported, but some time ago, about a year and a half ago, I did a program about it on this channel, and I believe we also discussed it on the Duran, and I once wrote an article about this as well. Anyway, put all that aside. Last night, the Russians announced that delivery of more grain to Syria from Russia has now stopped. The Russians are saying that this is because of the security situation in Syria, that it's impossible to distribute grain effectively across Syria, given the chaos and violence there. And I'm sure that is correct. And that the people who are involved in the supply of this grain, that they're not willing to go to Syria anymore because they don't feel safe, which I also, by the way, believe to be correct. So there are valid reasons that the Russians are giving for suspending, as they've put it, this supply of grain to Syria. Ukraine, by the way, has said that it is happy to take over and to supply Syria with grain. I don't think anybody in Syria should take that especially seriously. Very little Ukrainian grain, as far as I'm aware, has been diverted to markets for humanitarian purposes. Given the financial crisis that Ukraine is facing, about which the former British diplomat Ian Proud has just written a further piece on his Substack blog, I don't think Ukraine is in any position at the present time to make humanitarian or charitable gestures. It is going to sell every grain of wheat that it can in order to raise the hard currency it needs to keep what's left of its economy going. But anyway, the point is that the Russians are ceasing their humanitarian support for Syria. So, obviously, this has valid explanations behind it. As I said, there is a security crisis in Syria. There is a strong case for saying that people involved in distribution of aid supplies would be at risk. But I have to say, it also has a further look about it of the Russians taking a decision to leave and cutting the investment they had made in Syria, ending that investment, writing it off. Now, I understand that many people will find this strange, that the Russians should give up valuable assets in this way. There continues to be, I know, a debate that the Russians still have some long-term plans for Syria, and the discussion that continues to take place in some parts of the internet that there is that the Russians have laid some kind of trap in Syria, that they knew what was coming and that they somehow kept aside and let it happen, and that they're just conserving their forces, wait until their enemies in Syria, the Israelis and the Americans, and to some extent the Turks, also lose. I know that continues to be widely articulated and believed in by some people. I have never myself held to that view. I think that this is, as I said, overcomplicated and assumes a degree of forward planning in Moscow, of which I have never seen any sign at any point during Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict, stretching all the way back to 2015. But I have to say, over and above and beyond all of that, not only does this information contradict information that I was receiving, which is that the Russians were looking to provide whatever support the Syrian government needed to repel the jihadi fighters, and were completely shocked when instead the Syrian government and its army collapsed. But I'm also getting reports about fierce criticisms and a major blame game underway in Moscow about what has happened, with officials and members of the Duma, some of them associated with the FSB, criticizing the GRU, Russian military intelligence, for mishandling the situation in Syria, for not being prepared for what happened, that there's major criticisms. Some people in Russia still saying that it's important to hold on to the bases because of their strategic importance. Others saying that Russia really has wasted enough time and energy on Syria. It's time for it to go. So I don't believe there was any sort of plan. I don't believe the Russians are happy about what has happened at all. And I'm going to express my own view. Despite this blame game going on in Moscow, despite some people still saying that the bases and the intelligence assets are too important simply to be surrendered, I think that the ascendant wing within the Russian political and military establishment still believes that the situation in Syria is irretrievably lost, and that Russia should go and should end its further involvement in Syria. Continuing to invest in Syria is falling for the sunken costs fallacy, which the Russians have never let themselves fall into at any point in their history, just to say. And that ultimately, there is no sense in giving Erdogan leverage, and that the position of the bases is too unstable, and that it would be wiser and better and more cost effective in the end for the Russians simply to go. And if that is correct, and I think these moves, the interruption of the grain supplies, but even more, the dismantling of the air defense system around the bases, then if this is right, then, and this is of course purely my guess, then the discussions that are taking place between the Russians and HTS and the Russians and the Turks is merely a case of the Russians stringing HTS and the Turks along, so as to ensure that there is no interference with their troops as the Russians arrange for them to leave. And a rather extraordinary comment that a Russian diplomat is reputed to have made about the discussions with HTS, that the Russians approached HTS with friendship and love, to my mind reinforces that. It seems to me a classic example of the ironic, cynical way in which the Russians speak when they deal with people like HTS, who they fundamentally don't trust. So I think that is my own view about what is happening with the Russians in Syria at the moment. I've given the whole situation a lot of thought over the last 24 hours. Despite all of these talks and negotiations, despite HTS showing signs of wanting the Russians to stay, despite Erdogan having very good reasons for wanting the Russians to stay, despite arguments that are playing out in Moscow on this very question, I think Putin, the Security Council, and the leadership of the Defense Ministry and of the General Staff have made a decision that Russia should go. And it may take a few weeks for this whole operation to be wound down, but I expect that that is where we're heading. To some extent, all of this reminds me of the Russian pullback from Kherson City, which took place in 2022. There was lots of indications. It was all very confusing, as I remember. There were lots of indications that the Russians intended to defend Kherson City, located as it was on the west bank of the Dnieper. There were reports about, the Russians establishing fortified positions around Kherson City, all sorts of things of that kind. But there were also some telltale signs that the Russians were, on the contrary, thinking about retreating from Kherson City. And then it became clear that it was, in fact, their decision to retreat from Kherson City, that the Russian military, General Surovikin and General Gerasimov and the others, had made a straightforward military decision that trying to defend Kherson City would be militarily costly and dangerous, and that valuable Russian troops were being left marooned in Kherson, west of the Dnieper, where they were unable to perform effectively. And to the dismay and surprise of many people, the Russians carried out a successful orderly withdrawal. And I think that is exactly what we see playing out in Syria at this time. Now, that is my analysis. I might be wrong. People will no doubt push back and disagree. But I am reasonably confident about this. I feel sure that one of the big players that we have seen in this part of the Middle East over the last 10 years, which is to say Russia, has made a decision to quit the scene, washing its hands in disgust over the outcome of the whole affair. Now, I would say that there continues to be an awful lot of commentary about what's going on in Syria at the moment, which continues to be informed either to get things wrong or to be engaging in wishful thinking. There's been an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, about how the Ukrainians trained 20 drone operators for HTS and provided HTS with 150 FPV drones. And many people are seeing this as decisive in achieving HTS's victory. I cannot agree. Anybody who has followed the conflict in Ukraine at all seriously would know that 150 FPV drones are not remotely enough to make any significant dent in an army the size of the Syrian army. Drones like that hitting armoured vehicles, some of them can do significant damage, some can knock out an armoured vehicle, but mostly they do only superficial damage to armoured vehicles. You need to have lots of FPV drones, thousands of them, very highly trained operators to be able to make a difference. 150 FPV drones are not going to make any difference to a conflict. The Russians, supposedly, in fact, I have it on good authority, when the jihadi offensive began on the 27th of November, were intending to ship 10,000 FPV drones to Syria. And that would have made a difference, together with 100 highly trained operators. That would have made a difference. 150 FPV drones would make no difference at all. Frankly, that claim in the article makes me doubt the entire article, just saying. No doubt the HTS people were using drones to some extent, but Turkey has its own drone manufacturing capabilities, and I strongly suspect that any drones that HTS and the other jihadis were using, that the vast majority had a Turkish provenance. Just saying. As for claims about stabilization in Syria, I see no sign of them. There's been some claims that a strengthening of the Syrian currency it fell from 15,000 to the dollar, then to 30,000 to the dollar when Damascus fell, but then has strengthened and returned to 15,000 to the dollar again. That this is a sign of stabilization. If anyone who is familiar with what happens in these kind of situations where a state and government collapses will know that this is actually very common. In the days and weeks after the government disintegrates, it's quite common for a currency to strengthen, not because it's a sign of stabilization, but on the contrary, because people looking for the exits or desperate to buy food or whatever are trying to get their hands on as much currency as they can in order to extricate themselves from the wreck, especially if they fear that unless they can get hold of the currency now and spend it immediately, then in a couple of months' time, they will be left with useless paper. So it is actually very, very typical in these situations for currencies briefly to strengthen. And as for the claims that Druze villagers in southern Syria have been asking to be ruled by Israel, it's possible, but I think that, again, some of these reports look like they've been concocted and might not be real, and besides, I don't think it means very much for the long term. We are at the early days of the Syrian crisis. There are some reports now that in the eastern deserts, which were its heartland, ISIS now is reconstituting itself. All sorts of things, bad things, I'm afraid, are quite plausibly going to happen. We'll just have to see how events develop. Anyway, let's now turn to the situation, to the conflict in Ukraine. And, well, here we're getting further reports of more Russian advances in practically every area, with a major collapse of Ukrainian defenses south of Kurakhovo. Now, the Ukrainians had created some kind of fortified area south of the city of Kurakhovo. I believe that this was created actually some years ago, and it was based around a village in this area, which a village called Uspenivka, close to a place called Ganivka. That village has now been captured, or so it seems, by the Russians. The Russians have captured all of the surrounding villages. This entire defense area apparently has now disintegrated. There are said to be around 200 Ukrainian soldiers still isolated in this area. The Russians are conducting mopping up operations. But the entire territory south of Kurakhovo itself has fallen completely under Russian control. There are apparently still Ukrainian troops in a village called Yantarne, which is located immediately to the east of the village of Sukhiyali, which the Russians captured a short time ago, with all the Ukrainian defenses immediately to the east of this village having now collapsed, with Ukrainian troops there who are still holding out, now surrounded. I expect that those troops in Yantarne, those Ukrainian troops in Yantarne, are going to flee. They're going to try to escape what are now the closing pincers. There is really nothing to defend here. And there were reports a couple of days ago that the Russians, having captured the village of Stary Terny on the western banks of the Kurakhovo reservoir, were pushing south towards another village called Dachnie, which lies immediately to the west of Kurakhovo. There are reports that this was actually wrong and that the Russians have instead pushed further west, directly west from Stary Terny, and are now attacking another village called Shevchenko. Confusingly, there is more than one village called Shevchenko. There's one close to Pokrovsk, which the Russians have just captured. This is another village of Shevchenko located west of the Kurakhovo reservoir. Anyway, again, the fact that the Russians are pushing west here, the fact that the Russians are located in Sukhiyali, the fact that all the defenses south of Kurakhovo have collapsed, what that means in aggregate is that whatever Ukrainian troops still are in Dachnie, like the Ukrainian troops in Yantarne and the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo themselves, they now have only a limited time to retreat, if they can still retreat at all. There are some reports that, in fact, Kurakhovo is in fact encircled. Anyway, they have only a limited time left to retreat. I'm going to make a guess that over the next couple of days, irrespective of whatever orders come from Kiev, just as happened in Bakhmut, Mariupol, Ugledar, we're going to see Ukrainian soldiers making the decisions for themselves. They're going to ignore instructions from Kiev to hold firm, and we're going to see a disorganized withdrawal. In Avdiivka, as I remember, exactly the same thing happened. Within the next couple of days, I expect Kurakhovo, Dachny, Yantarny, all of these places to be evacuated by the Ukrainians to withdraw completely from them. There'll be very, very heavy losses. Many people will be killed and will be left dying in the fields in the winter weather. There are some Ukrainian troops who are already surrounded. Some of them, no doubt, are going to surrender. But anyway, I suspect that we're going to see a general retreat, and the entire territory south of Kurakhovo and Kurakhovo itself will soon pass under Russian control. And of course, there is still a Ukrainian, some people refer to it, the Military Summary Channel calls it a fortified area, a little to the west of this area. It consists of villages called Andreevka, Konstantinopil, which should be distinguished from the very similar village with the very similar name called Konstantinopolska, which is located a little to the east, which I hear myself that the Russians have now either captured or largely captured. It's located immediately to south of Suhi Yali, just saying. But anyway, there's said to be a fortified area based around these villages. I think that whatever resistance the Ukrainians try to set up in these villages is going to be ephemeral, and the Ukrainians are going to pull out from these villages too fairly soon. Now, over the last day, there have been some reports of the Ukrainians launching counterattacks south of Pokrovsk, trying to push the Russians back in Shevchenko and Novotroitsk, the two villages that the Russians have captured over the last couple of days. Crucial villages which position the Russians where they can start to outflank the Ukrainians. There's also a report today of a supposedly successful Ukrainian counterattack in Chasiv Yar, where the Ukrainians supposedly have recaptured some of the industrial buildings in Chasiv Yar itself. Of course, Ukrainian counterattacks do happen, and these counterattacks may have taken place. If they have, whatever gains the Ukrainians have achieved through them are ephemeral and almost certainly do not justify the losses from these counterattacks. But I'm going to say straight away, I think we should be very careful in assuming that these counterattacks have even happened. Over the previous days, there were a lot of reports of successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Velikaya Novosilka. The Russians were supposed to have been pushed out of the southern part of this village which they control. They were supposed to have been pushed out of the village of Razdolovka, which is located to the northwest of Velikaya Novosilka, and of the village of Novi Komar. But the latest information coming from the area of Velikaya Novosilka strongly suggests that all of these territories remain firmly under Russian control. So it doesn't look as if that counterattack in the area of Velikaya Novosilka, assuming it even took place, was at all successful. And something very similar happened over the last couple of weeks in Toretsk, remaining important town that formed part of the great defense line that the Ukrainians created in Donbass. The Zelensky line, it is sometimes called. The Russians captured large areas of Toretsk a couple of weeks ago. I thought that at that point it seemed as if Toretsk was about to fall. Then there were reports of Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians were supposed to have recaptured the Zabalka district and all sorts of other places. And then, suddenly, it turned out that the Russians were in control of the Zabalka district after all, and had just captured the central coal mine together with its various slag heaps, and were continuing their advance. And again, if there was a Ukrainian counterattack, it was clearly ephemeral in what it achieved. But more likely, after very tough fighting, the Russians probably rotated their forces in Toretsk. They paused before launching their next advance, and all sorts of commentators interpreted or misinterpreted this pause as indicators of a successful Ukrainian counterattack and of a supposed stabilization of the situation in Toretsk. The latest reports say that the Russians not only have advanced in Toretsk itself, but that they are now only 1.5 kilometers from the outskirts, the northwestern outskirts of this town, through basically low-rise buildings. It's unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to hold out in this territory for very long. And we also got many reports, as I remember, about successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Kursk region over the last few weeks. They were supposed to have recaptured a village called Nikolaevno Darino. And again, it could be that there were Ukrainian counterattacks, quite likely that there were. But just 2 days ago, the Russians confirmed that they'd captured the neighboring village of Darino, as well as the village of Pokrovsk, south of Syria itself. And, well, one way or the other, if there was a Ukrainian counterattack in Kursk region, again, the results were ephemeral, and it hasn't prevented the Russians continuing to advance. In fact, Group of Forces North have told us today in their latest bulletin that in the Kursk region, the Russian advance has continued, and that the Russians have advanced a further 2 kilometers in Kursk region. And just to continue with what they're saying that clearing of the area near liberated Darino continues. During the clearing operations, we took 3 servicemen, Ukrainian servicemen, as prisoners of war. The total number of prisoners that they've taken in the Darino area is now said to be 505. And they say this: in the area of Sverdlikovo, this is the single most important village now left under Ukrainian control around Syria. If the Russians are able to capture Sverdlikovo, which is in Kursk region, then we can definitely talk about the Ukrainians in Kursk region facing an operational crisis, because they will be very close at that point to being encircled. But anyway, in the area of Sverdlikovo, due to mass desertions and to refusal to follow orders, the Ukrainian army has a shortage of personnel to hold positions. The command replenishes it with assault troops, which further increases discontent amongst the Ukrainian fighters. And anyway, that's what Group of Forces North are saying. Clearly, they don't seem to have noticed any great Ukrainian counterattack in Kursk region, as some were claiming, just as I remember about a week, 10 days ago. So I don't want to dispute the fact that every so often the Ukrainians do counterattack, But all of the reports say that Ukraine is facing an increasingly critical shortage of personnel. This is no longer disputed. Ukrainian losses are so high that the Ukrainian army is exhausted and run down. And I don't think they are in a position to conduct successful offensives against a Russian army that outnumbers them by hundreds of thousands now, and which is pushing forward and breaking through Ukraine's key defense lines in position after position, with indications that the entire Ukrainian defense line might soon collapse, and with a particularly critical situation developing around Pokrovsk. So that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, there's been an awful lot said about the supplies that the Biden administration, the weapons and other things that the Biden administration is rushing to Ukraine in order to try to stabilize the situation there, in order to keep Ukraine fighting. And the Biden administration has just signed off on another $500 million military aid package. There's some who say that these Ukrainian counterattacks have been made possible by this big American inflow of weapons. I strongly doubt that, by the way. I doubt that there's been enough time to send all of these weapons to Ukraine. But anyway, put all of that aside. The one critical weapon that Ukraine lacks, that is putting in question its entire ability to conduct this war, is effective air defense. And if one picks through these military packages, I'm going to leave it again to Brian Beletic to do that properly. But if one picks through them, it's increasingly clear to me that the United States has basically run out of its ability to keep Ukraine supplied with surface-to-air missiles and other such weapons. And we saw the effect of that yesterday with the massive Russian missile and drone strike that took place across Ukraine. Now, most of it appears to have been concentrated on targets in western Ukraine. Lots of types of missiles were used. Kinzhal missiles were used, apparently. KH-101 missiles were used. All sorts of Calibra missiles launched by the sea were used. Iskander ballistic missiles were used as well. Zelensky and the Ukrainians have made all sorts of claims about their success in shooting down missiles, though they have admitted that because they had to focus so much on shooting down missiles, the hundreds of Duran drones that were launched and were also part of this attack, that the majority of them were able to hit their targets and were not affected. The point is, whatever the Ukrainians claim about their successes in shooting down missiles, and some months ago, General Syrski published, as I remember, a report which quietly downscaled to a substantial degree the number of missiles, actual missiles, that Ukraine had really shot down. Anyway, whatever claims the Ukrainians make, it's absolutely clear that most of the missiles and the drones did get through and have dealt extraordinarily heavy amounts of damage. This might not have been, in fact, the biggest and most powerful missile strike that the Russians have launched this year, let alone during the war. But the amount of damage that is being done is cumulative, and it is compounding. The energy system has been severely damaged. The Ukrainians are having to import more electric power from Europe, from the EU. The EU is experiencing energy shortages of its own. The winter is proving to be cold. There is a lack of wind, which means that the windmills, which have been so heavily invested in across Europe, have not been operating to the extent that is needed. The result is that the gas storage systems in Europe are depleting very fast. The EU probably will have enough gas in those storage facilities to get through the winter. But of course, if it is severely depleted, that is going to affect energy prices. It's already doing so, in fact, across Europe. And it's likely that energy prices, gas prices, are going to start spiking in the summer as the Europeans try to refill their exhausted gas storage facilities. It might be difficult to do that if we see the storage facilities even more severely depleted over the course of the winter than they would normally be. And of course, if you add to this already tight and very difficult energy situation in Europe further demands from Ukraine, that is going to put the energy situation in Europe under still greater pressure. So anyway, one way or the other, this is a devastating strike. It's having huge repercussions in Ukraine itself, and it's going to have a knock-on effect across Europe too, because to the extent that the European Union, European governments are committed to keeping the lights on in Ukraine, they're having to carry over the cost of doing that to their own energy consumers, even though, of course, they will never acknowledge it. Now, there are reports circulating that it was not just energy systems that the Russians attacked in their previous missile strike. I have seen some reports which say that the Russians were also targeting the F-16s, that they know where the F-16s are located, and that some of the strikes were carried out against F-16 storage facilities, and that more of these aircraft have been damaged and destroyed. So far, as I'm aware, the Russian Defense Ministry has made no such claims, and of course the Ukrainians have not admitted to that either. But yesterday, Zelensky said that 11 of the Russian missiles had been shot down by F-16s, operating for the first time in a serious way to counter a Russian missile strike. The fascinating thing about that claim is that the media across the West has downplayed it, which makes me wonder, frankly, whether it was true and whether possibly Zelensky talked up the story of the F-16s operating in the skies precisely because the Russians did indeed successfully attack the storage facilities where the F-16s were kept, and did indeed destroy some of the F-16s there. And Zelensky wants to keep the Russians thinking that there are still F-16s operational in Ukraine. There are also reports that the Russians specifically attacked an airfield and a location where F-16 pilots are being trained, and attack the facilities there also. Again, I have no corroboration to say whether or not that is true. Regardless, we now have, I think, fairly strong evidence that what I said yesterday is true, that the claim by the Russian Defense Ministry that the missile strike that took place yesterday was in some way a counter to the ATHEREUM strike on Taganrog, that claim by the Russian Defense Ministry is simply untrue. Before the Russians launched their missile strike, but after the ATHEREUM strike, a number of comments appeared on Twitter X, which said that it looked as if the Ukrainians had launched the attack on the airfield in Taganrog in order to preempt the big Russian missile strike that was coming, that was already clearly under preparation upon them. I don't follow the logic of that at all, just to say. As far as I'm aware, Russian strategic bombers that participate in missile strikes on Ukraine do not use the forward airfield at Taganrog, just to say. They use other airfields located far deeper inside Russia. But regardless of that, the point is that people had already clearly detected through the movement of Russian bombers and activity on Russian airfields that some big bombing strike was being prepared, missile strike was being prepared before the ATHEREUM strike on Taganrog. Now, that could mean that the Russians are still going to take further action in response to the ATHEREUM strike, despite what they said. And yesterday, US officials were floating the possibility that we could see more Oreshnik strikes over the course of this weekend. Well, we will have to wait and see. What I do want to say is that one major step towards de-escalation has been made. I've already made this point, but I think it bears reiterating. And it has been made by President-elect Donald Trump. It seems that the interview with Time magazine, in which he said that he vehemently disagreed with the decision to launch deep strikes on Russia, it seems that that interview was made as far back as 25th November. It was published later, not because Time magazine intentionally withheld it, but because it timed the publication of the interview for the announcement that Trump has been named Time Man of the Year, just to say. But putting all of that aside, Trump's statement that he vehemently disagrees with this decision, in effect, communicates to Moscow that after 20th January, irrespective of what Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Austin, and all of these people want, and of course Zelensky himself wants, missile strikes on pre-2014 Russia are going to end. So, given that this is so, the urgency, the need to respond in order to demonstrate Russia's deterrence has now gone away, because the man who in a few weeks' time, is going to be President of the United States, Donald Trump has already indicated that he acknowledges that deterrence. Now, on this topic, Scott Ritter has published a very, very interesting and rather concerning article about the missile strikes, the decision to greenlight the long-range missile strikes on Russia. He says that contrary to reports that have appeared in the media, the US intelligence community did actually advise the Biden administration that the warnings from Moscow about potential retaliation on US and European facilities, retaliation up to and potentially including the use of nuclear weapons. The US intelligence community warned the Biden administration that these warnings from Moscow were for real, that they were not bluff. And apparently some people in the Pentagon were very concerned about the administration's decision, nonetheless, to greenlight the strikes, and that this was also a concern within the intelligence community. And General Gerasimov's warning to General Brown apparently reinforced those concerns. Nonetheless, the Biden administration decided to press on, to disregard the warnings, not just from Moscow, but from its own intelligence community, and to continue these strikes, crossing the red line, even though, as we have seen, the strikes have proved to be militarily completely ineffective. Now, if that is true, not only would that be completely, incredibly reckless, but it would strongly suggest that there were some people in the Biden administration who actively wanted to provoke the Russians into some kind of massive reaction. One wonders to what end. Well, I'm not going to speculate about this any further. I take what Scott Ritter says extremely seriously. I'm sure he does have sources of information in Washington which are not accessible to me. He has apparently been speaking to people in Congress who also seem to be to have been very worried about this situation. So I don't want to give the impression that I doubt or am skeptical about this report. Quite the opposite, actually. But given that so far there is no official confirmation of it, I'm going to wait until Trump and his people come in, and hopefully at that point we will find out what actually took place. If this is really so, then the administration will have acted more dangerously and more recklessly than any other US administration in the whole history of the United States in the things that it did over the last couple of weeks since the election. In fact, it would have risked a possible nuclear conflict, which, as I said, I still find staggering. And the historical record really needs, if that is so, to both confirm that fact and to hold whoever made these decisions, if these decisions were made, to account. We shall see whether that happens. Anyway, let me finish now by turning to the other two subjects that I've wanted to just deal with. The first is the impeachment in South Korea of the President Yoon, who a short time ago astonished the vast majority of people in South Korea by declaring martial law without providing any rational explanation of why he wanted to do so. This morning, there is confirmation that he has indeed been impeached, that the South Korean parliament has now managed to pass a vote to impeach him. Some members of his own party appear to have defected and to have supported this impeachment resolution. The president has issued a defiant statement saying that he will continue and he will continue fighting. Apparently the impeachment has to be approved by the Constitutional Court of South Korea, though most people assume that that is a formality and that it will happen fairly soon. We'll see. All I wanted to say is that when this martial law crisis, this coup attempt, because that's what I consider it to be, played out about a week or 10 days ago, I floated a theory that the factor that had been driving it was the need to remove a recalcitrant parliament dominated by the South Korean opposition, which was obstructing the sale of weapons by South Korea to Ukraine. Now, no one has confirmed that that is so. At the same time, no evidence has so far appeared to suggest that that speculation was wrong. However, one should never assume a positive that that was the reason from a negative, the fact that there's been no evidence refuting it. But what I will say is this: it's now quite clear to me that the president not only was not acting on his own, I never thought he was, but that the original idea to announce martial law originated from sections of the military. The defense minister, chief of staff, various other people. The defense minister, by the way, has resigned after issuing an apology. I understand that one military official has attempted to commit suicide. There's been all kinds of things like that going on in South Korea at the moment. The fact that the initiative for this event appears to have come from the military rather than from the president himself suggests to me that the theory that this was all connected with the president's worries about the corruption investigations into his wife are wrong, and it reinforces my belief that this was all done in order to facilitate, against the wishes of the South Korean people and in contravention of South Korean laws, to facilitate the transfer of South Korean weapons to Ukraine. And given that the South Korean military appears to have been involved, at least certain important officials within the South Korean military were involved, that makes it far more likely, in my opinion, that the United States was at least aware of that something was coming and might have given it a certain degree of support, or perhaps it went further than that, and maybe some people in the administration even suggested it. I say that because I don't believe that anything important can happen within the South Korean military without the United States being informed about it in advance, and the military officers who appear to have been the supporters of the coup, who, to be clear, were only a small, though rather important section of the South Korean military hierarchy. Anyway, those officers seem to have been particularly close to the United States. So, just to say, for the moment, I've no reason to put aside my theory, and for the moment, the dribbles of information we're getting from South Korea, are tending to support it. Hopefully, we will find out, we will get definite information about what really took place in South Korea, why this extraordinary decision was made at some point over the next few weeks as the president's impeachment proceeds and as the investigations into the coup attempt gather pace, especially if there's going to be a new election in South Korea, won by a representative of the opposition, as now seems certain. Speaking about elections, there has now been a presidential election in Georgia, held through an electoral college. It has been won by an official of the government party, as was universally expected. The previous president, Mrs. Zurabishvili, refuses to step down. She insists that she will continue to occupy the presidential residence. She insists that the elections, the recent parliamentary elections, have no validity, even though they were given a clean bill of health by monitors from the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a fact that has been received almost no commentary in the West, and there continue to be large crowds in Tbilisi supporting the president, opposing the government, demanding new elections, parliamentary elections, and insisting that the previous parliamentary elections remained illegitimate. Now, the Georgian Prime Minister a couple of days ago said that his country had successfully seen off a colour revolution attempt. I think when he said it, that was premature. I think the decisive days, the events, are now going to play out over the next couple of days. If Mrs. Zurabishvili is successfully removed from the presidential residence, if the new president is successfully installed in the presidential residence, then the government will be in control of all the levers of power. It appears to have a majority of support across Georgia. Patrick Lancaster has been interviewing people in Tbilisi itself who oppose the current protests. You can find examples of those interviews on his YouTube channel. At that point, we can say that the colour revolution attempt has failed. We might be close to that point at the moment. I suspect we will eventually get to that point, but I don't think we are quite there yet. I think events still need to play out, but for the moment, it does look as if the initiative is passing to the government. Anyway, that's where I'm going to finish my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by checking out our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.